Chapter 6 of Waverley Goodbye, Part 2. So in this chapter, we saw the children walking around the village, knocking on lots of people's doors, trying to find a home for them. Renee's been chosen, so we've now got Shirley, Vera and Kathleen, and then Archie and Kevin still to find a home. They've just knocked on 2 old ladies' houses, and they've said they'll have 2 girls. So we're going to find out which of the 3 girls are going to get picked to live with them. So let's carry on. I knew my hair looked too plain without its ribbon, and I had 2 bloody knees and scraped shoes. But Kathleen had a bad complexion and a sulky expression, and Vera's broken glasses didn't help her looks. But the second sister shuffled towards Vera, smiling at her. "What about this little one?" she said. "Excellent," said Mrs. Henshaw, "and I'm sure you'll want to take her friend too as company. You'd like that, wouldn't you, Vera?" "Oh, yes," said Vera, and held out her hand to Kathleen. "She's my friend." My heart sank. Mrs. Henshaw put her arm around my shoulders. "Perhaps all 3 girls," she tried. "We can only manage 2 at the most," the first Miss Robinson said decidedly, "and that's going to be a push." "There will be an allowance, though the paperwork is going to be a massive task," said Mrs. Henshaw, "and doubtless it will all have to be organised by yours truly. Still, we must all do our duty. Thank you very much, ladies. Bye-bye. See you later, Vera and Kathleen." We left them standing uncertainly on the doorstep. So I was the last girl. I prickled with the humiliation. "So what about us, miss?" Archie said, tugging at Mrs. Henshaw's tweed skirt. "Why ain't we got nowhere to stay?" "Because nobody wants us, you daft little beggar," said Kevin, shrugging. I think he meant to sound as if he couldn't care less, but his voice wobbled. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Henshaw. "2 fine lads and a lovely little girl. Of course people will want you. We just have to find the right people. Now, let me put my thinking cap on." She looked back down the village street. Then she looked up at the hill. I saw the long white gleam of Lady Amersham's manor house. "I know," I said. "I know where we can go. Up there with St. Agatha's. I know for a fact they'll have spare beds, because Jessica said several of the girls didn't even turn up at the station." "I'm not going with no girls," said Kevin. "Me neither," agreed Archie. "Well, not them posh ones." "I could go though," I said. "Jessica's my best friend, and I know the others too, and Sister Josephine. Oh, please, Mrs. Henshaw, can't I go and live at Lady Amersham's?" "No, dear, you can't go there," she said, barely listening. She turned her back on me and looked up in the other direction. I came top of my class though, Mrs. Henshaw," I said quickly. "I'm a clever girl, and I know I might be able to struggle with all of the stuff that they teach there, but I'm sure I could pick it up quickly. And I was top at my old school too." Mr. Bentley tutted at me. Now, no one likes a show-off," he said sharply. I had a feeling he didn't know much of the stuff taught at that school either. Mrs. Henshaw wasn't listening to us. "I think I know where you can go," she said, tossing her head so that her feather waved in the air. "Just her, miss, or us too?" asked Archie. "I don't see why you can't all stay there. I'm sure you'd have a room each," said Mrs. Henshaw. "Do you see that big house up there? It's called the Red House." A red house on one hill, a white house on the other. It sounded like a scene in Alice in Wonderland. "I reckon there's at least 6 bedrooms, but only 1 lady lives there. Well, 2 ladies actually," she said. "Old ladies, like them Mrs. Robinsons?" asked Kevin. "No, the house is owned by Mrs. Waverley, a lady about my age," said Mrs. Henshaw. We thought Mrs. Henshaw must be very old, so that wasn't reassuring. Mr. Bentley didn't look happy either. "For goodness sake, do we really have to go traipsing all the way back through the village and halfway up that hill? They'll be getting dark soon. Why didn't we try there first?" he demanded. "I suppose you have a point, Mr. Bentley. Mrs. Waverley entirely slipped my mind. She's rather a recluse. She doesn't come down to the village very often." "A recluse?" he asked. "Do you mean she's not quite the ticket?" Oh no, she's entirely complimentous, said Mrs. Henshaw, spouting her precious Latin and leaving us all in the dark. She smiled at Kevin and Archie and me. Come along then, chaps, and chapesses, best foot forward. She's bonkers, Kevin muttered to me. Don't know what she's on about half the time. I didn't either, but I was too tired and sore to care. Archie seemed past it too. He clung to Mrs. Henshaw, sniffing continuously, and Mr. Bentley was making heavy work of carrying my suitcase, putting it down every 10th step and groaning. Oh dear, poor Mr. Bentley, said Mrs. Henshaw. Perhaps I'd better take a turn with that wretched suitcase. I have serious problems with my back, he said huffily, but I'll manage, I'll have to, though it's a shame some people weren't more considerate. He looked in my direction. Why don't you stay down in the village? Go to your digs at the hostel. I'll sort the children out, Mrs. Henshaw offered. Certainly not. I am the headmaster, and all Paradise Row pupils are my responsibility, said Mr. Bentley. Besides, I can't leave a lady unescorted. Mrs. Henshaw thawed a little and gave a girlish giggle. So we laboured on, dragging back through the village. Archie heard distant mooing and panicked. Mrs. Henshaw ended up carrying him and his cardboard case of tattered belongings. He probably weighed more than my suitcase, but Mrs. Henshaw didn't complain. When we started climbing the narrow chalk path that led to the Red House, Mr. Bentley looked at Kevin and said, Here, lad, you're almost as big as me. Perhaps you could take a turn with this case. It was more an order than a request. But Kevin was so skinny, I thought he'd buckle at the knees. But he proved surprisingly strong and lugged the case with scarcely a grunt. There, you should have offered sooner, said Mr. Bentley, with an astonishing lack of gratitude. I peered up at the house in the gathering twilight. I hadn't realised just how big it was. It had a special driveway with beautiful gates with hearts cut out of the wood. I ran my finger along inside the shapes. Hearts, I said. Aren't they lovely? I've never seen gates like these before. Mrs. Waverley had them specially made, Mrs. Henshaw told me. Mrs. Waverley came alive in my imagination. A beautiful, romantic, particular woman who floated around her lovely house in lace dresses. I hoped with all my heart that Mrs. Waverley would let me live with her. The driveway was long and unlit. The trees rustled overhead, a thick dark canopy. Huge plants sprang out along the side, their great umbrella leaves brushing my cheeks. It's like a jungle, Kevin panted. I agree with you. It seems very overgrown. Are you sure this Mrs. Waverley is still living here? Oh yes, I'd have heard otherwise. It's been a bit of a wilderness ever since, well, for a long time. The plants have certainly run wild. These big plants, they grow near water. There's a big pond somewhere. Can we fish in it? Kevin asked. I go fishing with my dad down Hammer Ponds. Well, I did once. You'll have to wait and ask Mrs. Waverley. Or Chubby, said Mrs. Henshaw. Chubby? Is that Mrs. Waverley? Is that Mr. Waverley? I asked, seeing him as a fat, cheery man with a waistcoat bursting its buttons. Inside my head. Oh no, dear Chubby is... I suppose she's Mrs. Waverley's maid, Mrs. Henshaw told me. Inside my head, Chubby turned into an old lady in a pinny, brandishing a mop. I hoped more than ever that Mrs. Waverley would take me. Mum would be so impressed if she knew I was living in a house where there was a maid. I silently practised what I was going to say. I'd better sound as grand and grown up as I could. How do you do, Mrs. Waverley? What a pleasant evening. I am Shirley Louise Smith. I would love to come and live with you. As the driveway twisted, I'd lost sight of the red house. But then we turned a corner. The trees thinned a little, and suddenly there it was. The tiled roof sloping up and down, the windows wide and patterned with glass, the door painted green, the wooden knocker shaped like a picture book tree. It was a beautiful house, but the surrounding flower beds were thick with weeds. Everything had grown immensely tall, and ivy was creeping up the brick walls, trying to smother them. I don't like it here. It's scary, Archie whispered, clinging to Mrs. Henshaw. Nonsense, dear, she said. But she looked worried, as she knocked on the door with the tree-shaped knocker. The house was so dark and still and silent. It seemed deserted. I jumped when the door opened suddenly. How do you do? I said, but then my voice tailed away. I didn't know who it was standing there. It wasn't a grand lady in a beautiful gown. It wasn't a maid in a white cap and apron. It couldn't be Mrs. Waverley. This woman wore a turban that emphasised her sharp cheekbones, a crumpled check dress with a tear under the arm, bare legs and pom-pom slippers. "What do you lot want, eh?" she said, crossing her arms and peering at us, eyes narrowed. She wasn't a lady, so she had to be the maid. She was skin and bones. Her little body as thin and flat as a child's, her wrists and ankles so stick-like they looked ready to snap. Chubby, she was the exact opposite. "Good evening, Miss Chubb," said Mrs. Henshaw. "I'm Mrs. Henshaw from the village, and—" "I know who you are, for heaven's sake. We grew up in the same village," the tiny woman said irritably. "Well, if you know who I am, you'll know what I'm doing here with these children." "They're the evacuees," Miss Chubb said scornfully. "I suppose you dragged them all the way up the hill as a last resort because no one else will take them? Well, you're wasting your time, Margaret. We can't take any kids here." "Oh, please will you call Mrs. Waverley Chubby?" Mrs. Henshaw asked. "She's the householder, not you." "You think she's going to say any different?" asked Chubby. "Madeline!" Mrs. Henshaw called loudly, ignoring her. "Madeline, please come to the door. It's urgent." "She won't come. She'll hide in her room. She always does," said Chubby, shaking her head. "Then I shall have to go and find her." Mrs. Henshaw pushed past into the hallway, hauling Archie with her. "Come along, follow me," she commanded the rest of us. Kevin and I exchanged doubtful looks. Even Mr. Bentley seemed hesitant. We edged inside, keeping close to the walls. They were patterned with dark green paper, with swirly leaves and tangled honeysuckle, as if the overgrown garden had crept indoors. "Come back here, Margaret Henshaw," Chubby shouted, but Mrs. Henshaw had already rounded a corner and opened a door. We heard a little gasp from someone inside it. "Would you credit it?" said Chubby, clenching her fist and darting after her. We followed, finding ourselves in a dark red room, with one entire wall covered in bookshelves. In the dim light of the single rose-coloured oil lamp, I peered at all the amazing books. The lamp stood on the table beside a chaise longue. On it lay a lady, propped up with embroidered cushions. She was wearing a long blue velvet robe, perhaps a dressing gown, and her hair was long too. It was pure white, and her skin was milky pale too, almost ghostly. She was too old to be pretty, but she was certainly striking. "Hello, Madeline," said Mrs. Henshaw, still cradling Archie in her arms. "I haven't seen you for such a long time. How are you? You do know who I am, don't you?" "Of course I know who you are, Margaret," said Mrs. Waverley, sounding dazed. "What are you doing here?" She looked at Chubby. "I didn't let her in," said Chubby. "She barged in without so much as a by your leave, bringing half a dozen little brats with her, and this stray bloke into the bargain. Cheek of it! I'm Mr. Bentley, the children's headmaster." "And there are only 3 children, Madeline. The last 3 of our little evacuees from London. I've managed to find homes for all the others, and I'm very much hoping that you will welcome these 3 into your lovely home," said Mrs. Henshaw. "Then you can think again," said Chubby. "We can't possibly act as nursemaids for all these London brats." "They won't be any trouble. They'll be at school most of the time," said Mrs. Henshaw. "You're to send them this coming Monday, please." "I should cocoa," said Chubby. "We never put our name down on that stupid form you sent round. It said it was voluntary. Well, we're not volunteering. We can't cope with kids here." "Circumstances have changed now that we're on the brink of war," said Mrs. Henshaw. "It is compulsory now. The law's changed. Every household with spare rooms is compelled to take evacuated children under their roof. I'm certain you have several spare rooms." I stared at her. She was lying. I hadn't realised that adults could lie as fluently as children. "We might have spare rooms, but they're not adequately furnished," said Mrs. Waverley. "Oh, don't give me that, Madeline. Your house is furnished beautifully. Mrs. Henshaw looked around the room. Archie stopped lolling against her chest and peered about sleepily. He looked like a strange little alien with his bald head and huge eyes. He blinked, a tear running down his cheek. Chubby's face softened as she stared at him. "Let's take the baby," she said to Mrs. Waverley. "He doesn't look too much trouble. I dare say I'll cope." "Very well," said Mrs. Waverley. "There you are, Margaret. Mission accomplished." "Couldn't you possibly take the little girl too?" said Mr. Bentley. "I can't carry her suitcase another step. It weighs a ton." "It's full of books, Madeline," said Mrs. Henshaw. She couldn't bear to leave them all behind. Mrs. Waverley peered at me. "Do you like reading, child?" "It's my best thing ever, Mrs. Waverley," I said. She seemed surprised, maybe even a little amused. "It's my best thing ever too." She looked at Chubby. "Perhaps we ought to take the little girl too." Chubby shrugged. "Well, you'll have to amuse her then. I'll have my hands full with the baby." "That's excellent," said Mrs. Henshaw. "And you'll take the big boy as well." "I'll write books and all," said Kevin quickly. He went to the bookshelves and grabbed one of the leather volumes. "See, I can read." He started slowly spelling out a sentence from the book. Stumbling over the long words, he tried turning the page, licking his finger and crumpling it slightly. Mrs. Waverley winced. "Please put that book back on the shelf," she said. She turned to Mrs. Henshaw. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm sure it's not compulsory to take 3 evacuees. I think the older boy would be happier somewhere else." "But there isn't anywhere else," said Mrs. Henshaw. "Please, couldn't you just take Kevin tonight? And then perhaps I'll find a place for him at one of the farms. But we can't go on traipsing around all night. We're exhausted." I looked at Kevin. His hands were trembling as he slotted the book back on the shelf. He started biting his nails again. His face screwed up, and I knew he was trying not to cry. I couldn't bear it. I went to Mrs. Waverley and knelt beside her, going down with a thump on my sore knees. It hurt so much, it was easy to start crying myself. "Please let Kevin stay too," I sobbed imploringly. Mrs. Waverley sighed. "Oh, very well," she murmured. And that is the end of chapter 6. So I hope you enjoyed that chapter. And finally, all of the London children that arrived on that train have found a home. Well, for now anyway. Bye everyone and have a lovely weekend.